Everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for being in the last panel. So the idea from for this panel actually came with after a few discussion with my colleague Evgenia, in which we realized that basically there is a lot of talking in crisis early warning models. They can be helpful. However, there may be actually a mismatch between what we have at the moment and where the world is going. In the sense that so far we basically developed those models and trained those models and collected data for those models, thinking to a world where the main security challenges came from intrastate wars. But as we may have noticed in the last few months or few years, unfortunately, there has been a shift in how violence developed and interstate war actually became again more prominent on the war stage. And so then the question is, well, do the models we have and that we have been spending time building are still helpful? Can still help us maybe not to prevent, but at least to mitigate the consequences of escalation of wars in which in this when we face these new challenges. And therefore, we thought to gather, both people and researchers that work on the creation of those early warning models, researcher that works on the collection of data that have been used for this structural, to develop structural indicators for those and features for those models, but then also ask to practitioners if the models that we have been using and we will be using, how can we make them more effective in order to uh, yeah, make them more effective to achieve their goal that they are supposed to do, which is, I would say, mitigate the suffering and the devastation that conflict brings. So before going forward, then I will ask Evgenia to go a little over the structure of our roundtable, and then we can proceed to a short introduction of our panelists.
Thank you so much, Marco, for starting us off. Just for the audience to know how we will structure the session. So we will have a quick intro on the state of the art on forecasting methods. We will have a live audience element where you can also give us your view on what are the biggest challenges and blind spots in early warning today. We will have our distinguished panelists talk about the challenges that they see from their perspective, and we will have a speed solving session, as we call it, where we will collaboratively think about how to address these challenges and also discuss the results from the live audience polling. So without further ado, I give it also back to Marco to start us off with a quick overview of the state of the art in forecasting.
Yeah, so, well, the in maybe redundant for some of us, but let's just a bit for on the same page. In the last years, basically, we saw that crisis early warning had a moment with with computational capacity and development of new models. The idea has been try to create models that could help us to foresee the occurrence of violence with some with some with some anticipation. And so far, basically, we developed both models that work at the country month or at a lower temporal dimension, or at the subnational level, both at the administrative level or grid level. And we know that and for after a few generations of those models, now then we start to also introduce a situation where we look at the distribution of probabilities in order to try to foresee escalation. And there's been also a variation in the type of target variables we want to assess. So we moved from just forecasting the number of fatalities, number of events, escalation dynamics, the escalation dynamics, and so on and so forth. So we saw an evolution also on that side. But what I think is also quite interesting is the fact that while we had quite a development in the type of models we've been using in order to predict violence, we see that generally speaking, the features that we use for those models are kind of always the same. We always see a much propensity. We also see that we generally see that in the feature importance of our models. Past violence, proximity of violence, they always score quite importantly. Quite high respect to other structural variables or other variables. And the point is that while this may help us to model national and subnational dynamics in areas where conflict has been constant or has been present for a long time. This we have less capacity to forecast rapid escalation of conflicts in where conflict has been absent, and this also then open open the question if then when it comes to interstate wars, those models actually will perform to the same extent. They will have the same capacity um, to foresee violence when we do not have the same. When we try to model different dynamics of violence. I will actually stop there to don't take too much time to our panelists, and yeah, so then ask them quickly to introduce themselves now, not as before.
Then should I go first? Um,
Yeah, I would suggest to go on the order of of the schedule we circulated.
okay, but then just introduction and then afterwards the talking points. Okay, then just briefly to introduce myself, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me on this panel. I am currently based at the Crisis Center for Crisis Early Warning at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich. I recently started there in March, and before that, I defended my dissertation at the Uppsala University with a focus on understanding and predicting conflict-related mobility dynamics. And at the same time, I've also worked within the area of predicting conflict and also election-related violence. So my background focus is also more on the prediction side, especially for this panel.
It's my turn, right? Hello, everyone. My name is Johanna Majapanche. I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores. I research on the influence of international organizations and peace inclusivity. I have also developed some research on civilian harm and civilian victimization. I have worked with United Nations and other organizations on the policy side too. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew George. I'm the program director here at the Arms Transfers program of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The things that we are interested in is the monitoring of transfers of major conventional weapons around the world. We focus on all transfers from a state to another entity. It can be from any entity to another entity as long as it's major conventional weapons. And apart from that, I am also interested in looking at the evolution of arms and the technologies in use by different states. And that's it from me.
Hi, Marco. I'm following Matt. My name is Rebecca Richards. I am with the Geneva School of Diplomacy as part of their doctoral program. I currently work for the United Nations. I've been with the UN across political and humanitarian realms for the last 26 years. Currently with the World Food Programme and specializing in food security, famine, and the connection to conflict.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's my turn. Great to be with you. I'm Achille Després. I work for the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, currently in Geneva. I've worked for about 10 years at the ICRC, most recently in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, in Israel and occupied Palestinian territory. And my focus is response to crisis in terms of communication. So obviously I'm here as more of a practitioner. I was super excited and interesting to hear from many different analysts and academics. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Cool. So then I will ask Evie if she can introduce the poll for the audience, because then, the point of this then of the roundtable is to ask ourselves again, if then the models we currently have first are helpful right now, but most importantly, if they can still be helpful for the practitioner in the future, and then if we can find a way to build on them.
So without further ado, we can turn also to our panelists, and we will start with Maxine, and everyone has about 4 to 5 minutes to tell us a little bit more what they think are the current challenges when we think about early warning.
Great, thank you very much. I'll try to time myself as well, just to make sure that I don't talk too much. So as I said, my background is in terms of the forecasting area, and I've been previously working with forecasting conflict and election-related violence, and I've approached kind of this question a bit more in terms of so what can our current forecasting systems do very well, and where and why might they actually struggle with interstate conflict? So in terms of a little bit also in line with the introduction that Marco gave. And I think I want to highlight or discuss 3 related points. And I think about the first one, we've heard plenty already during the conference, which is the data. And I think one of the most interesting also takeaways from me now during those days has really been kind of this tension between points, where we have on the one side that this like huge excitement about the new amount of data that we can collect with the new tools that are actually possible, also to collect better data, but also more near real-time data. And on the other side, however, also this challenge or tension in terms of how well we know our data. And that's also something that has been mentioned in the first day and today again, in terms of we really need to be aware as well what our definitions actually are of the data, what it actually can tell us and what it cannot tell us. And I think that's also particularly relevant or interesting when we think about, okay, can we or how could we forecast also interstate conflicts more rather than civil war, intrastate conflicts or related dynamics. And I think in that sense, it's also like more data doesn't always mean more signals or better signals, right? When we think about the forecasting perspective. And for example, just thinking in terms of interstate conflicts, when we see that if we train our data on data that just has a lot of peaceful diets, we're not going to really capture these signals. So I think there's also a really interesting avenue to really think more about like what kind of data do we need. So I'm also curious to hear more from the other panelists about this topic. And I think here it's just relevant basically to know as well, so what was our data designed to capture and what wasn't it able to actually or designed to not capture in terms of prediction. And then the second point is related to that in terms of modeling. And I think here as well, like with a lot of the tools that we've been working, these are like pattern recognition tools, right? So the models have become really good to be trained on historical data and to like learn those patterns in our historical data and then predict them or project them into the future. And this is also something that Marco has mentioned, which has made us much better actually at predicting, for example, fatalities in an ongoing conflict. But we still have very much troubles when we want to actually predict, for example, the onset of new conflicts also within the area of intrastate conflict. And I think if we think about interstate conflicts, there's like this challenge, but then there's like a second dimension as well, where it might not only be this like pattern problem, but also a strategic interaction problem, right? Because we also have like different actors that in the same sense also drive kind of what we can actually observe in terms of like what they want or observers to actually see, but also then about all the signals that we cannot track. And I think here it's also, again, relating to the data, interesting if we think, for example, what is publicly said, but then what can we see in terms of the military positioning, and thinking more in a way how we can capture these signals. And then I think building on this, I think it's also just relevant to be accurate or honest also about the limitations of our forecasting systems now, but also in the future, and seeing that, well, still we are much better at, for example, capturing these background risks in terms of, okay, we see that there is like a risk that this might escalate, but not to really kind of capture the point of like the tipping point. And the question is also, will we really be able to do this in the future if we just rely on models, or do we also really need here kind of this point of human interaction, or like humans that actually tell us like what to make out of these models, to also then predict interstate conflict? And I think, yeah, that's it from my side for now.
Thank you so much, Maxine, for this input, maybe more on a technical side, but I hope that everyone can follow and also link back eventually in the speed solving session. Now we wanted to also ask Joanna to share a little bit her perspective on what she thinks the challenges are, given her expertise in international relations in Latin America specifically.
Great. Thank you, Finia. Thank you very much for the invitation. There are many possible blind spots we could discuss in this panel. For the sake of time, I will focus on one, the gap between producing warnings and acting on them. This is usually called within the literature the warning response gap. I approach this from my work on civilian victimization and the role of international actors in conflict-affected regions. And my main claim is simple, is that early warning systems have become increasingly sophisticated at identifying lethal violence, conflict onset, escalation, and high-risk cases, but the conditions that allow warnings to become civilian protection are becoming more fragile. And in that sense, perhaps the problem is not only whether we can produce weather warnings, but is whether the institutions receiving those warnings that have the political will, legitimacy, resources, and incentives to act on them. Perhaps a useful starting point within the literature is comparing conflict early warning systems across three dimensions that are usually mentioned as challenges: transparency, accessibility, and key parameters and forecast. And this is important because the design of warning systems is never neutral. The outcome variables, the spatial unit, the forecast horizon, and the availability of code and data all shape what becomes visible, comparable, and for the purpose of my topic, contestable. So if a system is designed mainly around armed conflict onset, battle-related fatalities, or country risk rebel, then other forms of civilian harm may remain secondary or invisible. So this does not mean that those systems are not valuable, but they are indeed. But this means that we can forecast most confidently is not always what matters the most for civilian protections. Other parts of the literature has said that early warning is not only to identify risk, but is supposed to trigger action. But yet they showed that the practice of early warnings continues to lag behind its technical developments. So the point to problems of real time data quality are most related to political will. So I would like to frame the warning response gap not as a problem that appears after a prediction has taken place, but as part of the early warning itself. So a warning is not just a signal, is a signal that should be embedded in institutions, mandates, interest, and political will. And if relevant actors are unwilling or unable to respond, then the warning already is constrained in the moment that it is produced. This matters particularly when we think about civilian victimization, because most of the forecasting literature works with events, fatalities, conflict onset, escalation. So these indicators are essential, of course, but they are partially capturing how civilians experience war, but not all the ways civilians experience harm. So some of these forms of harm are harder to observe than battle events. Some are reported late, some are politically denied, and some are visible only through civil society organizations, humanitarian organizations, or community-based information rather than conventional conflict event data. So if early warning is tied too closely to what is easiest to count, we might risk mistaking measurement for protecting civilians. The literature on violence against civilians also remind us that civilian victimization is not merely a collateral damage. It can be a strategy of war. So it can be used to punish perceived constituencies, control territories, weaken the adversary's capacities, and to change the composition of contested spaces, which are relevant indicators to analyze civilian harm. So to move to the space of interstate conflicts, this adds a further challenge because in contemporary interstate conflicts and wars, the evidence of civilian harm may be highly visible, but we may have satellite imageries, open source investigations, humanitarian reports, casualty monitoring, and real-time media coverage. But yet, more visibility does not necessarily produce more protection. So response is mediated by political dynamics, alliances, veto powers, escalation risk, legal contestation, and information about the warfare. So this basically means that more evidence can sometimes produce more constant contestation rather than more action. So actors may dispute what counts as credible evidence and whose data should be trusted, whether civilian harm is intentional, and which responses are politically correct in a specific context. So in this context, the warning response gap is not simply a failure of coordination, it's a political challenge over shared responsibility. So perhaps we might be entering a moment in which early warning capacity is improving technically, and as the former panelist analyzed, is increasing the capacity to gather data, while the response capacity is weakening politically and financially due to different dynamics. And that's a very serious contradiction. So it means that we may build better alarms while dismantling parts of the fire brigade. So in general, for civilian victimization in interstate conflicts, the main blind spot may not be the lack of warning systems or the quality of the information. The more important problem, perhaps, is that the response gap may be widening even when warnings are robust. So the task perhaps here is not only to improve models, but to reconnect early warning with institutional conditions to make civilian protection possible and more stable. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I think that was a very neat follow-on what Maxine has said, but also delineating a very important aspect that maybe for practitioners is quite obvious, oftentimes on the ground, and We see it with many international organizations that they are suffering from budget cuts. So this is a very well-observed point. Thank you so much for sharing this perspective. And I would give it over to Matthew George to continue the delineation of the challenges.
Thank you. Well, I'm actually wondering what to add because it's all been covered really well from both the speakers. Because from the way that we look at it from our side, we look at the movement of arms, and there is this argument that, well, if you can try to understand how much of these arms are moving from one place to another, could we then try to understand, is there a buildup of arms somewhere? What's really going on? But right now, when we are looking at it, what we find is that we have a couple of these issues. One is there's a whole lot of this data that is being generated from different signals. How do we, as a small little team sitting out here in Stockholm, verify all of this information that's coming through? So that's one of the things that Maxine mentioned. And so what are the resources that we have right now to, one, see if this information is true? Is this information verifiable? Is this propaganda or rhetoric that is being passed on by someone else? Or if nothing else, is this just normal behavior that is not really something that should be alarming, but part and parcel of the regular apparatus of a state to do what it has to do. And then at that point, it is about the resources that are available with a particular organization to do this. And then, of course, that's compounded by the fact that, well, it's not as interesting to parties to support something that's already functioning. It's always, what is the new thing that can be done? What's the other thing that can be added on to this? So that's one side of it, but we can park that because I think that was discussed quite a bit through the 2 days. But for us, the other side of looking at what is missing is you have only a certain side of the angle if we are to look at arms being moved from one place to another. The other side is what is actually being produced locally. Because that is not something that anybody is looking at, both in terms of a historical, in a historical time period. You have some data points that look at, okay, what is there right now, but not so much about how has this changed over time. And what does that mean for right now or 6, 10, 12 months down the line? And that's where the other side of it is. It's in a way because the data is opaque and not reported. But on the other side, just because nobody has spent the resources to do this in a systematic manner. So again, it comes back to resources and the availability to do this, but that's the other side. It's about, one, we can look at the flows, but we also need to look at what is being generated that can cause issues or increase a particular side versus its neighbors in a potential conflict situation. But over and above all of those things, it's despite whatever we have that can send these signals, if you don't have the capacity to contextualize all of that, it's just going to be noise. And that aspect of it should not be looked at really lightly, because all of this quantitative information that we are getting will just be noise till it's contextualized. And just to give a sort of example of that, it's that for decades the Persian Gulf has been one of the largest importers of arms, but that did not automatically mean to a situation where we saw those interstate conflicts the way that you would between the actors who imported the most. So there was that contextualization that we would need to give value to what that meant. But now we're also looking at and really understanding that we need to also focus a lot more on national production, but it's not something that we are going to do here at CIPRI just because we don't have the resources. Yeah, but that's it from me.
Thank you for sharing or reiterating some of the points that have already been made. But it's also an interesting point that you made about the contextualization of information and whether the noise or the signals that we get from how we maybe quantitatively measure certain things is really what is going on locally. So this is a very valuable point, and maybe I'm going into the last two speakers, Ms. Richards and then Monsieur Després. Maybe they also have some supporting insights from the field on these points.
Thanks, Evie. It's really nice to follow on from the topics that have been covered so far, but I'm going to take a slightly different viewpoint because I guess having started out my career in Afghanistan and looking at the conflict there and actually having the privilege to be part of the Bonn peace process, which brought in a kind of democratic process following 9/11. And then if we look at where we are today with Afghanistan, it's an interesting arch, coming back to something that in that moment, I certainly felt there was all the political will to bring stability to a country that has a lot to offer the broader region there and is politically had the attention of the world. But then over time, in terms of investment and support, that seems to have taken the wrong trajectory, and we are where we are today with the Taliban back in administrative power. So I think that has really framed a lot of the research and work that has followed me in that time, and looking very closely at food security and food insecurity as an indicator. So it's one thing, I think, to be looking at conflict from the point of view of arms, of course, and defense, and casualties, as Joanna was talking about, and really seeing, I really like the way Maxine's research has also been going, but looking at it from a humanitarian angle, and I feel that we're missing an important point that could actually generate different type of insights. And this was really behind why we pushed the partnership between the World Food Programme and CIPRI, because we wanted them to come in and have a look at the work of WFP in these fragile contexts to see, is there a link between food security and conflict? And interestingly, they were able to show us not just that hunger causes conflict, and conflict can cause hunger, but there are different elements of that that can then influence how we work as a community to either move the dial towards peace or not. And I think we need to keep our eye on that. This way, I love the conference that you've put together, and it is data for peace. So if we were to be looking at that as an ultimate objective, then I would want to look at our early warning systems a little differently. So we've had on the World Food Programme side a huge contribution to what we would say is the system-wide early warning system for famine and hunger, which is called the IPC. So integrated phased classification, built up over a period of time and really around building consensus and consolidating data. On the plus side, it involves numerous actors, which then means that no one person or one organization can say this is the state of play when it comes to hunger in a country. So great. On the other side, building consensus and collecting all that data, churning it out, and then getting to a point where everybody agrees, okay, in this part of Somalia, in this part of northern Nigeria, in this part of South Sudan, this is the state of hunger, then takes so long that by the time the results come out, you have almost a year lag. So things like the Global Report on Food Crisis, fantastic piece of work supported by the EU, but it looks at data a year ago. So how does that then work? And that brings me then to the Hunger Map Live, a fantastic early warning tool that then starts to layer in some of the data that CIPRI has, some of the data ACLED, some of the conflict data in real time with a bit of AI capability that gives you a prediction looking into the future. Excellent. So then we have what I would say enough evidence to provoke policymakers to really make take a step into a situation and do something differently from a decision-making point of view. That doesn't happen. So I would argue we have the capability on the early warning side, but our blind spots are really around the political will and potentially, I would say, also political economy, and that being missing from our early warning systems. So I find that we're all working in silos, and that's why I really like this panel. I wanted to do it because it was like, what can we be doing differently as different communities? And I think that's where solutions need to be developed. I think there is a link missing with research and expertise in the humanitarian system. I think there is a huge link missing with our diplomatic community. And by diplomatic, I'm going to be a little bit wider and bolder and talk about military and defense. Military and defense capacity on the early warning side is second to none, but their objectives are very different to the humanitarian side. So I think a second blind spot for me would definitely be the politics of data. What can you protect? What can you be collecting and translating and feeding into decision making that doesn't compromise response actors on the ground? So I find that as a community, we're doing amazing work. And yes, everything is underfunded, but our starting point is never quite what's the decision we want to get to. Our starting point is what's the data available? So I would challenge my fellow panelists and those in the room to shift their mindset a little bit and look at it through a different lens. There's collaboration that needs to happen across sectors, and I'm deliberately speaking as the Geneva School of Diplomacy and not as the UN, because I think we need to think outside the box. And that would mean a closer partnership across non-traditional actors in this particular field. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this input. I think many of your points also speak to one question that was put in the Q&A, especially about, I guess, the politics of data, as you call it. Someone from the audience noted that dis and misinformation is a really big problem also. So one question is, can you trust the data that you collect from open sources, and how can you verify? That's also something that Matthew said, but also what does the shrinking space for journalists mean when we think about what outputs they produce, and that eventually also many researchers, for example, or other organizations use to collect data. So thank you so much for this insight, and then I will hand it over to Akil as the last to wrap up this first part.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is really great to speak after all of you, but also I'm looking at my notes, and basically all of the points that I wanted to bring were already covered, and I wanted to bring in another one which was just brought in by the Q&A from the audience. So I'll try not to repeat too much, but from where I'm sitting, right, with the ICRC, and obviously armed conflict being our main area of focus, exclusive area of focus, I really endorse everything that Rebecca, who spoke right before me, said with regards to the need for better collaboration, and also the gap, the main problem being not so much the models. I mean, of course, the models can have problems, but the sort of gap between a warning and an action. And so I think this is obviously a political issue, so I don't want to dive into it so much, but I think it's important that it be there. If I go back to basically what I, as a, let's say, representative of the humanitarian sector, wanted to highlight in terms of the snapshots of what I see as gaps, one of them being essentially what you just said, this idea of information integrity. Obviously a growing, I would say, number of our predictive models, they are relying on open source information. They're relying on information which is, whether we like it or not, affected increasingly by misinformation, by deliberate disinformation, including by state-sponsored, action that, to an extent, they are themselves part of the conflict dynamic. So this kind of can mess up a little bit the data. And it's also, obviously, for us as the ICRC, our main concern with that is not so much that it affects the analysis, but rather that it affects the community suffering for violence. Nevertheless, that's also an important thing, that it makes it kind of harder to distinguish, to an extent, between what's a genuine warning signal and what's just noise, to quote one of my other panelists, or just a manipulated narrative to take the conversation into a certain direction. Another thing that I think really important to mention is that, and this kind of echoes also what a former panelist mentioned about the need to rely more on local contextualized sources. This is certainly what we do at the ICRC. We rely heavily on our, you know, engagement, very confidential and bilateral, but with local interlocutors, community leaders, and all that. But whilst there is a need to do that, to an extent, the fact that there's shrinking media capacity, journalist access, you know, this we can see all around the world, but in some places it's evident, and insecurity that affect you know, those reporting on war, that also limits the access to independent information that is at the local level. So it's really also difficult to bridge that. Although, of course, relying more heavily on contextualized and local sources, this is something that we should do, that we aim to do. And also, I think from a humanitarian point of view, there is also kind of a limit with regards to early warning, kind of in bridging it with humanitarian action, because to an extent, early warning systems, they help us kind of estimate violence, the probability or like the likelihood of violence occurring, but it doesn't tell us a lot about the questions that we as humanitarians would ask ourselves, such as what specific needs will there be? What specific population or communities rather will be impacted? What can we do? Will access constraints be more or less? So I think this is more for us on the humanitarian side to deal with, but I think it's also a sort of a gap. And I don't want to be too long, but I wanted to make a couple other points just with vis-a-vis the kind of shift from intrastate to interstate conflict. And obviously, a lot of models are optimized for more civil war rather than interstate escalation. So that's a clear gap. And it's also interstate conflicts, as we've seen in the past few years, they can escalate much faster than we think, like because they're so linked to single political decisions that somehow it's almost impossible to plan for those, as opposed to intrastate dynamics that kind of like are nurtured by longer cycles. So I think I don't really have an answer to that, but I think this is something that we should keep in mind. I think I'll leave it there. And sorry if I repeated some of the earlier points, but I really enjoyed the conversation before. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think these are all excellent points that all of you mentioned, and we have a little bit more time to maybe talk about some solutions or maybe think about collectively about ideas of how to address maybe a couple of the things that you outlined as challenges. And maybe just a quick note on the audience poll. We wanted to just to try it out. Maybe it was a little bit too quick. I think there was a little bit there was a little bit of engagement, but some of the things that also you said were also covered by the audience. So we will directly move into the speed solving session, as we called it, and I'll hand it over to Marco for that part.
Yeah, so thank you. That was a lot of food for thought. So I'll be sharp and direct, don't subtract time. So, Maxine, well, I mean, models, like, I mean, how much we can stretch them. So basically, like, I mean, is there a way in which we can maybe transform what so far we think noise or fake news in actually signal, in the sense that maybe, like, I mean, if there are fake news, maybe we can process them to be like an signal that something is going to happen. And like I mean, to Rebecca and Achille, okay, well, true. But what can now, like I mean, don't think what your country can do for you, but think what you can do for your country. So, what can you provide to the Maxine in the world in order to make better models? And To Matthew and Joanna, like I mean, how academia and research institute can actually help to bridge this? I mean, can be the glue between these two worlds. Few ideas not bound to be answered, but maybe we can start from those.
Then I'll go first, I guess, in terms of the, yeah, I mean, and I think that it's not an easy question to answer how we can collect signals from noise, right? If we would know that, then I think we would have much less problems. But I think, I mean, that was already mentioned as well here in this panel, and I think like context really matters for that, right? To better understand what we're actually picking up, what are those signals? And I think if we just look at the data and don't think what it actually tells us, then that's where we're going to have problems. So maybe it's less about actually being able to like disconnect the signals from the noise in the beginning, but then really afterwards making sense of it. But then at the same time, I mean, there are also like data collection efforts like UCDP and others that really also put effort into actually looking at the sources that are used, for example, compared to other data sets that are much more auto-generated, right, where you don't really have these interactions. So I think it's also just, again, the responsibility of the researcher or user and what not to kind of know what goes into your model and think critically about that.
Who goes first? Well, I can't. It's a very interesting question, Marco. Thank you. I think that perhaps we can, from the academia side, can help to translate technical awareness into policy relevant question. Who is at risk, on what form of civilian victimizations are more or less likely, who has the mandate to respond, and what resources or political constrictions can be seen to stop or shape action. So perhaps creating dialogues and raising questions that are relevant to create ways to institutionalize protocols and ways to respond and to decrease the response gap.
I can step in from the other side. So I think one of the things that was mentioned was there are really good ways in which you can collect data, but in some fields, like in defense and security, there's a question about how much can you make public. That was one of the arguments that really went into trying to build or have the UN Register for Conventional Arms back in the late 80s, 90s. But way before that was the work that CIPRI was doing with the arms transfers program, and for us to have all of this information publicly available from the late 60s all the way till now. So that is an argument that states could make for things that should be remaining, classified, should not be released. But we've done it, and we're providing that year on year. And so the question is, should it really be classified and not available? And what is actually in the public space? Is it stuff that you can use? And we have shown that you can, and we continue to do so. And hopefully we continue to do so into the future. So that is one way in which we can show what is available and how we can build on that. But on the other side, it is quite an interesting way in which how we bridge from having just that to really asking states and other actors, well, this is what we have. What are we trying to do with this? And then move towards using this data towards peace, where we are questioning basic questions like, is this really the best use of state resources in terms of rearmament? Is this the best use of resources when it comes to a share of GDP in something or another? Is this the best use of aid when it is used somewhere else, or the forms of aid that are being used? So those kinds of policy questions are stuff that we can provide. We have done so, and so we get to in some way bridge the two sides. But of course, how this is taken up, where it is done, all of those are sovereign questions and sovereign answers that fall outside our realm. So the only thing we can do, as much as we can, is to provide that insight and data where we can. And of course, we do this by triangulating and making sure that we don't follow one narrative, but we look at all the information that comes through, and so we give verified data as much as we can. So we're not really pushing for a narrative versus the other with the data. We provide the data as we can verify it. And of course, if we fall short, we always are asking states, well, you haven't really reported this in your reporting. Please tell us either why that's not there or why we are wrong. And we'd be more than happy to be corrected. But more often than not, states are really happy to take our data and use it as is. So we'll see.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, then I will go back to our practitioner and asking them, okay, so then what, I mean, so clearly you are, I mean, you were clear in what are your needs. And so then I wonder, like, I mean, so if you could ask, like, I mean, if you could ask to the other panelists, let's say, like, I mean, a short list, a wish list of, like, I mean, of not only things that you wanted, but I mean stuff that you can provide them in order to help them to give you the information you would like to have in the next crisis early warning system that yeah that I mean in crisis early warning system and models that you will find useful for your work.
I
Sorry,
think
was
sorry.
no, I was just going to ask, who was that directed to?
I mean, to Rebecca or Achille, like, I mean, depend on I mean, who want to answer first?
Sure. I'm happy to bounce off Ashil as well if Ashil, if you want to come in with me on this one. It's great to be sharing the platform with ICRC. So Marco, from my side, um, having looked at the fact that there's a whole political neutrality issue on the data, I would say that having some of our research institutes and experts collaborate together on the data that's missing. So whether that's arms, political economy, trade, economic, sanctions, so on and so that layer, that political economy layer needs to be brought in with the humanitarian layer. And if it's done with AI, you should be able to have a much stronger prediction on issues such as access. At the moment, the model we've got with the Hunger Map Live is really good for longer term climate related shocks, but not so great for the political conflict related. So I think there's a real gap there. I don't know if it's so easy from an ethical point of view to simply pull it together. I think what we could be looking at is some of our research experts standing in between humanitarian and political realms and almost being the intermediary. And I think that's something we should start to explore where there's a buffer so that you can continue to shield the response actors, but while building in the right information and material in a way that actually influences policymakers. But to do that, you'd need to have those research institutes almost build it together with the policymakers rather than the humanitarian response actors. So I know I'm talking about taking us out of the equation, but I think that that's a conversation we should be having. And I would challenge my panelists and those listening in to pursue that as the next step.
Achille, if you want, if you like to add on that, or
Not necessarily add, but just to say that I really, really endorse what you've just said. And I mean, it's a really kind of awkward situation for humanitarian organization because when we're doing, for example, at the ICRC, large-scale conflict preparedness, obviously we are working with states as interlocutors, or they would like to see us as, let's say, partners. But at the same time, they're doing so rather candidly and openly because they know that we are working with them in a rather confidential manner. So there's a kind of almost a trade-off of like, you know, an earlier panelist said that, you know, militaries, they're the ones that have the most information on this, and rightly so. And we engage with military very, very closely, but they're not going to be very happy if we then go on and say, oh, military from country ABC said whatever. So I think it's really, there's a really difficult, you know, trade-off between like also the amount of preparation that you as an organization put into large scale conflict preparedness. If you publicize it too much, it can actually be in conducive to a conflict dynamic. So this, like, it's a bit weird to an extent that we want to work on this, we do work on this, but there is an element of doing so too openly may actually defeat the purpose of what we're doing it for. I hope that's clear. I know I should wrap it up, so thank you so much.
thank you. So, I mean, so first of all, thank you for the panelist. That was very interesting, and well, I mean, again, learned a lot. That's nice. But before leaving you, I'd like to pass for the last time the words to Evgenia because she may have, like, I mean, a last small treat for, like, I mean, an after panel session.
Yeah, so whoever is interested in learning more about the CPRI Arms Transfers database, I have put in the Zoom link in the chat. So at 17:45, Matthew George will walk us through the database. So if you still have energy, please join us and don't miss this opportunity. Thank you also from my side for this really nice discussion, for sharing your expertise. We have not solved everything, but that's also okay. But the input you provided is nevertheless very valuable and hopefully will bring us a little bit closer to solutions in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. That was great.
Thank you all.